Okay, so these slides are gonna be boring, but it'll be fun because we're gonna talk about UX, user experience design, and we're mainly gonna focus on mobile games, which has been my specialty for quite a while. So who am I? Hi, I'm Colleen. I'm Colleen Nachtrieb. I've been in the game industry for 14 plus years. I think it's now 15 plus years, whatever. Who's counting, really? I've worked in all sorts of platforms. I've worked in PC, on MMOs, and console, and handheld, and mobile games. The last 8 years has been specifically in just mobile. I'm currently the UX manager at WB Games in Boston. And I originally started out in 3D animation and art. I was actually in film for quite a while doing animation and storyboarding. And while I was working at the Bugcat Creations at Activision, I started doing user interface design and game design generally, which moved me over to do UX and UI design for the rest of my career because I loved it. I thought it was a great way to do both design work and art. And I also have a corgi. His name's Ziggy. He eats everything. So the wonderful world of UX. Don't worry, we'll get to pictures soon. So the user experience design, I moved my mouse and everything just popped in. I was like, no. So the user experience usually starts with understanding of player behavior. When you're designing for UX, you're starting from the player's standpoint. You're trying to think about what the player's going to be doing, what are their thought process, what are they looking for, what are they trying to do in your game, and you're trying to make something that's intuitive and delightful. It's also consistent for someone to use. So you can see this throughout any app, not just games. Anytime you're doing an interaction of any kind, it's going to feel good. You're not going to think too long on a screen, and usually it's going to make you want to stay in the application itself. We also design all the initial flows and wireframes and interactive prototypes that are going to inform engineers and other designers about what the game is going to really feel like and what it's going to do from screen to screen. Usually when I start a game project, I take just really high level all the major screens I know that the player's going to hit or going to go to. So like if I'm in the collector screen, I would map out all the various features that the player is going to go to and how they would get to those areas, and try to create loops from there. I probably should do a whole presentation just on that, maybe next time. The other thing we do is we set up user tests and focus tests. So we always have a design assumption whenever we start, and then we test that assumption, and then we iterate like bananas on that assumption until we find something that we feel like the player's really working. A lot of times in the game industry, people get confused between what is UI and what is UX. A lot of the times a UX designer or UI artist will end up doing both of these jobs. In some studios, they do two separate jobs. The real difference here is that UX deals with a lot more design work, thinking out the problems, the edge cases, functionality, and outlining rules for functionality, where a UI artist is thinking of visual language, coming up with user interface, visuals, exporting art, coming up with borders, coming up with font styles, fonts, typography, and then implementing those styles inside of a game engine. Again, sometimes I do both. For a while, I used to do both, and then I was like, this is crazy bananas. I need more people. So a lot of the times when you're really, really small, in a really small company, or just you're doing your own game with like 3 or 4 people, you'll be doing both of these tasks or both of these roles. Sometimes a system designer will be doing UX. Whenever you start thinking of your game, you should already start thinking about who your target market is. You should start thinking about who are your players, what other games are they playing, what are they spending money on. The mobile market, unless you're going for a one-time purchase game, if you're going to do microtrains, you're going to want to think about what are the loops the player's going to be spending money on, what are the systems they're going to be engaging in that you can then monetize on. I know a lot of people don't like monetization. I like to eat, so it doesn't bother me as much. But the other things you're going to think about is like demographics. Who are your players? What other things outside of games do they engage in? And then what are those player types and player behaviors that they fit in? there's a whole graph of players that fit into people who enjoy PvP, people who enjoy being loners, people who enjoy just going out and being an Animal Crossing fan, just collecting all the different dresses, hats, and glasses. That would be me, and putting them on your animals. And knowing all that information really impacts how you're going to be doing different flows and creating different screens and systems. Again, a whole other topic for another day. So I think my child is yelling because I'm yelling, because I'm talking really loud. Hold on one second. Okay, I think it's okay. Okay, great. Yay, remote. So let's talk about just the goals when you're doing mobile. The real key goals whenever I go into a UX project is thinking about how I'm going to create the holistic experience. This is the experience from the ground up of how the player is going to be engaged and experience the game from really high level, and then I drill down into individual screens and individual elements and how that all comes back to the larger holistic vision of this player experience. So if I'm making a horror game, all of my screens and elements need to then come back to the sense that this game is going to terrify me. This is going to be an unnerving, edgy, sketchy kind of game, and therefore my visuals and my communication around that should back up my high-level vision from a holistic standpoint. On each screen, to fulfill those goals, I'm going to think about, for a mobile game, how I'm going to engage the player, which is just like, again, how I'm going to make it sketchy, how am I going to make it really unnerving and grotesque as a horror game. Retention, how am I going to keep them to come back? What's going to keep my player engaged, or like going to engage my game, but coming back to the game, such as like this is where like timers come in and those kinds of systems, but this is also where like notifications or UI are going to come up. There are things to keep the player coming back, also like events and making things seem really exciting when I'm going into an event. And then of course there's monetization. Once you get a player to monetize, you're going to have an investment from the player. They're going to want to come back to your game because they put money into it. So this is creating those reward loops. This is a loop similar to when I buy an item, understanding how I'm going to use the item, tapping on the item, seeing information about the item, and then how to purchase more. So this is where I'm actually going to get into the pictures. Don't worry, we're not going to look at white slides like all evening. We're going to talk a little bit about your game's layout and orientation, calls to action, and how they impact the player. All of these things are going to be just like wide guidelines, and then we're going to drill down into them. So the first thing is when you're looking at designing your game, you're going to be designing it for multiple interfaces and multiple places. These devices sometimes are really wide, like the iPhone X, which all UX designers love the iPhone X because it has a notch, which gets in your way. I'm sorry, I'm being sarcastic. We don't like the iPhone X. It's annoying. Why did you do this to us, Apple? And then there, you have an iPad, which is super fat and super short, like a corgi. It's like the corgi of all devices, the iPad. So when these are the two differences of these interfaces from the same game. So this is Marvel Strike Force, iPad, and then the iPhone X. You can see they have drastically different kind of setup, but their interface is responsive, so it actually stretches and grows based on the confines and anchoring of the game's interface. So how you would set this up is you would use different layers for your different elements, and then anchoring those elements. So here I have this, then we're just going to do the top bar. The top bar here, we're going to have stretch with width, so that when we're on the iPhone 10, you're going to notice that this middle area is going to stretch out real far. And then you have, oops, I went too far. No, now I need to go back. I won't let me go back. I'm so sorry, everyone. That one showed you that these elements on the side were anchored to their sides, so that this middle area is the thing that gets wide, but these still stay in their respective corners. And then that's to allow these things to properly stretch and grow based on the width of your device. So when you're designing this, you're looking at both the iPad's width and your iPhone 10, so that you, especially if you're in landscape, so you're looking about how much actual space you have, and anchoring that and stretching it properly so that when you're on iPad, these aren't going to come back in together and intersect or overlap. Then you're thinking, well, Colleen, how do I decide between portrait or landscape? Dun, dun, dun. Oh, no. This really depends on what your game, like what kind of game you're making. It depends on if you want it to be like a more cinematic experience or if you want it to be a little more casual. It really depends on your gameplay. So for example, a 4X, a war game, is usually portrait. And it generally, like, I know King of Avalon is landscape, but bear with me. War games tend to be, and idle games tend to be portrait, specifically because the player length of the play length session is usually about a minute or less, and a player is going to be exiting the app constantly and going to like Facebook and their email, and all of those applications are portrait. Whereas some collectors or more cinematic games that have movies or QuickTime events or need to have like a battler where you have 4-on-4, or you need that width of your screen to make it look like a TV. Those games, those play sessions tend to be a lot longer, or they expect to be a lot longer, like 20 minutes, which is like, I'm going to go to the bathroom and eat a whole sandwich or whatever. Why are you eating a sandwich on the toilet? We don't know. That's terrible. Don't do that. But yeah, that's usually when you're making those decisions, you're trying to think about what the player is doing and for how long. Like, let's say you're in a war game and you want to get to Discord. You're going to be on Discord in portrait. So let's make our game in portrait. So you're just taking all those kinds of questions in mind when you're trying to determine what's going to be landscape, what's going to be portrait. There's another way of determining this as well, and that is figuring out your hit areas and how you assume that your player's going to be holding their device. So this is to show you all the kind of different ways that you're intended to hold your device and hold your thumb. As you can see with landscape, you have a pretty limited set of a reach, your thumb reach. I have seen some people hold it like with one hand and tap, but who does that? That's unusual. That's really unusual. So usually with landscape, you have your 2-thumb arc, which means that most of your calls to actions are going to be down the bottom of the screen, and your hard actions are at the top. For portrait, you have it's a little bit harder to determine where the player is going to have their best reach. Usually a high hand has a pretty good thumb arc, but you have to understand sometimes like smaller hands, or they're incapable of using their other hand. They'll be using one of these pinches. This is like my mom right here, and probably me. Okay, so again, I'm just going to put it into a color graph of where you're going to put elements on your screen, because this is like the hard area. This is the easy area, and an okay arc to try to reach these things. This is again on iPad. iPad, people tend to hold with 2 hands and use the pointer. This comes into play when we're talking about elements and where elements go. This is Shop Titans, and in Shop Titans, they have their money up on top, their main HUD. They have special offers and their quest tracker, and then they have their main navigation. And then this is the button. This is their main call to action of like everything you do is in the craft. So this is how they split up the screen. They did out of reach area. Like, this is the thing that's going to be hard for a player to get to. This player has to stop what they're doing and actually reach up to get to it. This is your medium range. So this is like your mid actions. This is mostly usually like active gameplay. And then here is the easiest stuff to reach. This is near the bottom of the screen, near their thumb. So this is like their primary actions. This is something they're going to be interacting with a lot. And that's how they determine where these things are going to go. Again, we're going to break down Marvel Strike Force. So again, because this is landscape, this area will be your big hitter area. And then if you're holding it on the sides, anything that's close to the edges will also be within your thumb arc. So this is your main area. This is your secondary area. This is your hard to reach. So again, a lot of these elements are not clickable. So like the name, this status bar, I think you click on it to get more information, but it's not something that you're going to be mainly navigating to. Your player profile is probably something that you're not going to go to that frequently, so that's why it's all the way up the top. This is also because generally in standards, in games, your portrait is top with level, but functionally, this is why this element is there. Element placement consistency. For all those people with children, I apologize. We've been all at home. And as we all know, if you have consistent rules with your children, they're better behaved and they know where things are. This is the same with UI and UX rules. If you keep your rules consistent, your player will know where everything is because they consistently will tap on them. So for example, if you put a close button in your right-hand corner, the player will learn that that's where they go to close. Same with your main action. If you put it at the bottom center or bottom right, they'll know it's there. They'll learn that it's there. The minute you move it to a different place on the screen, it'll take them like a second, 2 seconds to figure out where it is. And those seconds will add to frustration and fatigue for the player. So please be consistent with your functionality and of course consistent with your appearance. There's a lot of games I've seen where their info buttons, they have like a question mark, and then another place will have like an eye. If you do that, the player will wonder, well, what's the difference between this one and that one? They're looking for the eye, but now they find a question mark. So those kind of visual languages need to be figured out with your UI artist. If you are the UI artist, figure that out. Come up with what the function is when they see that icon and they're going to click on it. Also, put it in the same place every time so they always know where to go to get to it. And it's like when Google changes your app, like they change Gmail, and you're like, now I don't know where my inbox is. Yeah, this is the same idea. Some people might have questions for when my game is live and I have to make changes like that. It's always good to then put in another tutorial to teach them where it is now, or do it slowly and do a lot of focus testing before you make it go live. Do A/B testing on it. Try to see what the impact will be before you actually push it. Now we're going to talk, I know I'm like blowing through this, I'm so sorry. So now we got strong calls to action. This is, those are those big meaty parts of your game that you want your player to know where to go and what to do. This is like purchase buttons. This is like just select my guys and send them on a mission. This is any kind of action that you absolutely want the player to do, that you think is most important for your game. And these are usually called out by shape, color, the location, which should stay consistent, and of course the size. So again, if we're looking at Marvel Strike Force, you're going to see that the largest button on the screen, that's bright and orange, is the daily objectives. And the daily objectives are gigantic like that because they want you to hit through all the goals in the game. This is pretty much their key to keeping people engaged, and then also bringing them back into the game later to retain them. Once you go into this interface, you see a giant picture of Wolverine, and you're like, oh yeah, I gotta get Wolverine. And they want you to go there, they want you to see that, and they want you to see how close you are to getting him. And I'm sure they did a whole bunch of A/B testing with focus groups to see that Wolverine was like the most popular character ever. So again, this is the shape, the color, and the location are all like spot on. So it's right in your thumb mark. The color is bright orange, which is contrast to the blue interface. The location is always right there, your thumb mark. I already said that. The shape is actually slightly unique. It's a straight cornered button. It's like one of their only like straight cornered buttons they have. And the only thing is that like the size is big, but it's actually not as big as like their secondaries. But these almost don't read as buttons at first. So it's not that big of an issue. Again, on their other screens, they use the same colors and they use the same shapes to say that this is your primary action. Primary action is always going to be orange, so it's going to be on the right. It's always going to just be in your face and do the same shape. And we're going to go to Shop Titans just to show you another example of where they're doing this. If you look at the craft button is bigger than all the other buttons. It's bright and green, which again is a contrast to their reddish purplish buttons down here, which brings your eye to it. And it's right in your thumb mark. And then we've got Harry Potter, Wizards Unite. You can tell all the games I was playing when I made this slideshow. This one we've got, it's a little bit harder to find, mainly because everything is green in this interface, like everything is green. I think brown is their secondary color. So they do use green to call it out. However, everything else in their interface is green, so sometimes it gets washed out. Their size is the size of everything else, but they do have a consistent location. And their shape mimics a lot of their other shapes. So it's not as strong of a call to action as the other two examples we just saw. And here we're going to get into notifications and messages inside the game. So every game you're going to want to have notifications. Every time you see a notification as a player, you're going to get fatigue. And you get fatigue over seeing what messages you're going to get, especially if you get spammed too many times with that messages. A lot of the times you'll have like a stakeholder. If you don't have a stakeholder, because you're like you and like 4 other people, you have it made. Just keep these rules in mind. If you do have a stakeholder, and that stakeholder's like, I want all the buttons to be the most important, you need to put on your designer hat. You're like, no, there should be some kind of rule around what button is the most important right now, or what we should call action. So we're going to go through some examples here of notifications and messages. If I'm going too fast, you guys can unmute yourself and be like, Colleen, slow down. Cool. Okay, so notifications. So here we've got Hogwarts Mystery. Can anyone find a notification? No, it's because this is a little dot that's right here. Very small. It's hidden in the background in 3D. So you're not really aware of it, and it's not actually anywhere on another interface, like another button that's higher up in the hierarchy to tell you that there's something else that you can do. It does use a color that's different than the green. You can find a lot of their notifications are really tiny. Like this one is much more prominent, but again, it still hides a lot inside their interface. So it's actually very hard to find. Well, a good thing about this game's notifications is it doesn't tend to spam you. They usually only have 1 to 3 notifications at a time. So you can see this one, you can see this one again in the world. And these are actually, it's really sad, but these are actually the same notification, the same thing, which is fine because one is in a 3D element and one is on the hierarchy. As you saw from the previous screen, they're not consistent about that, and sometimes it doesn't show up. I suppose we have Marvel Strike Force. Marvel Strike Force, everything gets a red dot. This is a game where I returned to the game, and I had so much mail that everything had a notification on it. This is a case where a UX designer might come in and say, okay, at what point do these notifications expire? Or at what point does these notifications need to pull back so that the player can actually concentrate on the thing I want to show them? There's also the use of push notifications that you could use in this case where you're like, I really want the player to come back because they're really close to getting Wolverine, or a new character is dropped, or they have a new claimable item. But you should come up with a queue or some kind of list of importance and try to call back those other items that won't be important. Then you can slowly bring them up to the player later on in their session to remind them, hey, this other thing came up. These also all have the same visual weight, so everything is important. So Shop Titans has this special offer. The special offer is the better deals with the Hourglass. And right now, it does have the special border that tells me that it's different, excuse me, but it doesn't actually attract me to this button. It's also in my difficult, it's also in my hard or medium range. So it's not a button I can easily reach or get to unless I'm left-handed or I'm your pointer. So here, this is one of those cases where I would tell the stakeholder or designer, I'd be like, listen, I think putting an attractor on this button, like a small animation or particle effect, would be best. And then I would A/B test it, put it in front of several different people, see if the player notices the button more and is more likely to actually click on it. The other thing is that this will open the shop, has special deals, special items I want to buy. The only thing that's telling me right now this is a better deal is the language on it that says better deal in the border. The Hourglass only tells me that it's limited. I don't actually get a timer. So I have no idea when this is going to run out, and I don't know they give me. I don't give a carrot. Whenever you have like a special offer or a deal, give the player a carrot. Show them the thing that they might get. Give them the thing that might excite them to buy it right up front so that they're tempted by it. Like say, here are the camels rugs. Get them to get those rugs. So those are all the things that I would do to improve this UI. There are a lot of UIs that do this really well. Like Shop Titans does have a pretty good setup for their interface. But this is one case where I was like, it's really weird that your special offers look like everything else. And again, the gameplay length also has a really big impact on where you're going to put things. Where, like, if you're going to have cinematics, if you're going to have button responsiveness, things of that nature come up a lot with your player length. So sometimes if you know that their player length is going to be like 20 to 30 minutes, then you can get away with slower responsiveness because the player is more willing to wait. Whereas an idle game, the responsiveness has to be like under a second, or most players will get fed up and they'll leave, and then they'll churn. Oh, that's bad. Bad sauce. This is the big difference between mobile games and console games, where most console and PC gamers, their session length is usually around 4 hours, 2 to 4 hours or more. So they're willing to put up with, you know, a loss of loading or background asset loading if they have it, especially on PC games. And they're willing to also have a lot of their UI hidden. Where mobile games, all your UI is usually up front and on your screen at all times because there's no outside input, right, to actually access that UI. I blew through this, guys. I could have talked about UI and UX for like all day, but I've actually entered the end. So I'm ready for questions. I think I'm gonna do a part 2 to this, where I'm just gonna like go over style guides and functional guides. That might be helpful, but I would love to know what you guys find useful to know about UX and the process, or anything about UX or UI design. Yay!
Thanks, Colleen.
Wow, great.
Yes, thank you very much.
Really awesome. Thank you.
Cool. I couldn't see my clock this morning, so I had no idea how long. I was like, I could talk for UX for hours. I hope my slideshow is short enough. Trapping here.
It's only been like a half hour, or maybe 40 minutes or so. No, not long. It's great.
Cool. Because I could totally go on more, guys. If you guys want me to present more, I could do another part to this. I was really curious on what people would like to know about.
I know we've got a couple of questions in the chat. I don't know if you answered them during the talk, but
I couldn't actually see the chat during the talk because my slides so I didn't see the questions. So if I could just go through the questions.
Sure.
For sure. So I think the first one came from Alex. Alex, I don't know if you want to reiterate your question or if you want to read it.
Sure. Yeah, I was just asking a quick question about, like, is there a maximum size or most amount of real estate your button should take? So I know that, like, of course it varies depending on what your intentions are as a developer, but like in general, is there a best practice saying, like, listen, your buttons or your interactive menu areas shouldn't take up more than like 20% of screen real estate or 40% of screen real estate or something like that? Like, what are some best practices or guidance on how much space buttons should take up on your UI?
Yeah, so there's actually some really awesome guidelines from Apple and Google on button sizes in general, like the minimum button size they require, I believe, Apple, I think it's like 48 pixels for iPhone 8. That's, when you look at it in like a program like Sketch or Photoshop, is actually pretty big. But it's about the size of the tip of your finger or your thumb. Anything smaller than that, it makes it a hard hit area. So a lot of times if you want to save yourself more real estate, for like visuals, you want your button to look smaller, you can actually make the hit area larger than the button. That just means that you might have some misclicks where people are clicking near the button and actually clicking on it, which can suck. But yeah, there are standards. If you just go to Apple or Google and you go to user best practices for UI, they give you a bunch of standards for button sizes. For your question about like different places on the screen, like your upper HUD or your bottom button, for me, it's always tricky because like the questions really to test it with a player to see like what can they interact with and what's going to cause them to fall off. Usually the upper HUD for me, I usually go around like 100, 120. It's like as wide as I can, like the smallest I can make it top. I might be able to make it a little bit smaller, but there's other like tricks you can use. You don't have to make like a solid bar. So now you have a little bit more of your view behind. If you just have like the modules being on transparent backgrounds, it's more expensive, but you could do that. It might make it slightly harder to read as well. The bottom tends to be, it's usually for main navigation. There have been some games where you have it like, you saw Marvel Strike Force, their main navigation is actually on the side because they're landscape. That tends to be a lot bigger only because you're usually trying to make space for words as well to inform a player what's going on. I hope that answers your question, Alex. I know it's a little bit wishy-washy, but it really depends on what kind of game you're making. And as long as you don't go below this guidelines, you should be good, because Apple will flag you if they're like, this text is too small or this button's too small. And a lot of the big reason why they do a lot of that is actually for accessibility. So someone who has a handicap or someone who can't read well, those people, like Apple's really careful and cool about that. They're like, hey, your font needs to be able to be sized up for people who need glasses. For no one who can see me, I just move my glasses up and down like a nerd. But yeah, that's generally the guidelines that at least I use. When I'm inside of my programs to make any of my interface pieces, I usually create like a component library where I have all the sizes measured out, and then I have a document that lists what those sizes are to reference. And maybe I will dig one of those up for you guys next time.
Thanks. So I see Tom Farrow also has a question. Tom, I don't know if you'd like to unmute yourself to ask the question, or we can ask it for you.
Just now with minimum standards from platform providers like Apple and Google. That totally answers the question. Thank you.
All right.
Sweet, small buttons.
And then we have one from Jake. What dev platform do you use?
Like what game engine?
I suppose.
Sure.
You're saying Unity or whatever.
Yeah. So I've primarily been using Unity, though Unreal's Blueprint's pretty awesome too. Primarily for work, I've been using Unity, though. Yeah. And then most places have proprietary tools, but they've been doing a lot with Unity's been doing a lot with their UGUI tools, which are actually pretty nice right now. And then I've used Unreal in the past, so that's what I primarily use. What do you use?
Jake will have to answer that one.
Okay.
Yeah, I can answer that.
Jake also uses Unity.
Nice.
Brad M would like to know, how do tablets affect the hit areas?
How do tablets affect the hit areas? I'm trying to figure out exactly what you mean by that. You should. Wait, what do you mean by how does it affect the hit areas? Like, do you think it would change its size or?
He's mentioning how does it affect hand placement?
I think one of your earlier slides addressed that with an iPad, right? You had the comparison.
Yeah. So I can try to share that again. So with the, I can't believe we see that I can. So you can hear with hand placement for tablet. If you just tilted this on the side, again, a person's going to be holding it on the size of a tablet, and usually their thumb arc will be similar to the phone area, but with that two-hand grip. So like this. But if you imagine that this device was wider, that's your iPad. So things become more difficult to hit once you're in the middle if you're holding it with two hands. So this is wide, and then you'd have that same kind of arc, and it's tall. Is that helpful? And that's something that you have to keep in mind of when you're designing for both the devices and placing items. Is like, if this is going to be on those different devices, making sure that your hit areas are kind of in that same good range. So are you frightened of super long foldable screen devices? They're on the tech horizon. Oh, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be fun. I generally like those kinds of challenges. But yeah, usually after a while, you get to a point where like, okay, we're not going to support certain devices because this is certain limitations. Usually it's like the lower end devices, or the higher end devices. But yeah, the foldable is going to be super cool. Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Actually, building on that, I have a question. Are there already any like ongoing UX guidelines that you've been using relating to foldable screen devices?
I'm not sure the foldable, but we have been doing new guides for like the beveled, just because beveled has been creating a bunch of different issues. I feel like I'm designing now. Back when I used to do console games, and I used to have to work on tube TVs, where you had the safe areas, or like, I don't know if anybody else had to work on these before, but you had your safe area, and then you had your safe for words area, and then you had your screen bleed. Like, that's what I feel like I'm designing in again, because we have like all this stuff outside of the screen. Like, you have your notch, and you have your bevel, and your screen's gonna press, and now you have a note. You have basically a safe area for pressable items, and then you have like, this is gonna look pretty, but it's not functional at all. So the big trend used to be putting things on the edges of the screen so everything looks fat, so you get this big picture. And now you're like, now I have to move everything in by like hundreds some odd pixels or 76 pixels because of a notch or because of a bevel. And you're like, does it look better? Does it look better, Apple? But yeah, they're interesting problems, because then those things have to bleed into other devices that don't have those features. So there are, yeah, actually there's a bunch of programs like Sketch and Adobe starting to implement it that have pre-made templates that actually call out those areas on the screen so you can design around them, and it does all the math for you, which is awesome. Otherwise, you're doing a whole bunch of grid math.
Zachary had a question. Prior to that, do you have any guidelines to maximizing ads while not ruining the UX?
Maximizing the ad experience? So yeah, ads are a thing that we need for monetization. So I think you can do different fun things with your UX to make ads more interesting. So like Tap Titans does a really cool ad where you have the fairies. They kind of bob in and bob out, and you click on them to play an ad. That makes it kind of less jarring. I don't know if this is actually answering your question or not. A lot of other games, they put them on a button, so it's like an optional, or we have them on a timer, so they go away after a while. That tends to remove fatigue for certain players. And then there's always opting into an option for players to turn them off. Sometimes you can pay like $2, and you're like, I no longer want to see ads. So there are some things inside your system that you can do to try to minimize the fatigue that players get from ads. It's usually better to have a player opt into an ad than it is to just like kind of force an ad. Okay, how do you gather market research and what data is useful to look at? So yes, so there's different kinds of tests you can run. So when you work for a big team, you can get data your data science team. And you can also have, we have a consumer insights team that does a bunch of focus groups, but as a smaller group, you can still do these same kind of tests. You can go on to, there's certain sites that you go on to, like you can pay like a small fee, or you can just sign up for a free month and get all sorts of data on different games in general. For market research, what I usually do is I used to do a lot of focus tests, or I do like Facebook ads, and I put up A/B tests of different UI or different art to try to figure out what players are digging or what they want to click on or what they want to do. You can do focus groups through like, this is gonna sound really lame, but like you can just do a SurveyMonkey and set up your surveys that way, and get your images placed next to each other or one after the other, depending on your test. And start getting feedback that way. The most useful data I get, I like to take both quantitative and qualitative feedback. So if I can get some hard numbers where I can just kind of track what people are clicking on, and then also doing a survey to see what players actually think of my experience, I find that more useful, because then I can take what they're saying and I can put it to like the computer telling me what they're doing. And that way I can determine like, is a player misinterpreting what the experience should be, or is like, so for example, I've seen data where a player will tell me, I don't like this feature because I can't do X, but then the data is telling me that they're constantly interacting with that feature, which means that they're super engaged in it and they're actually even spending money. So now I have to figure out, how do I get them to be a little bit happier, but still keep that engagement up. I've also been in tests with kids, like through Lego. We used to do tests where we'd bring the kids in, we'd watch them actually play the game and take notes. Those tests were always very interesting, because if you had the parent in the room, which I tell you, never have the parent in the room, the parent will say, you think this is fun, right, Billy? Like, that was fun. You saw where the quest was, you knew where to go. That's the kind of test you don't want. You definitely don't want someone, your questions can't be leading. They can't be telling the player what the answer that you want them to come to, or else your data will be incorrect. I could do a whole presentation on that as well. You know, I'm gonna write that down, because that's always really fun.
Just to follow up on that, Colleen, one great place that you guys listening and the talk can go for feedback would be any of our video game events, including events like Boston Postmortem, Boston Indie Demo Nights, and things like that. Bring your games there and then ask those of us to test them, and in many cases say, well, what do you think you're doing, right? You know, use us as a test group. Now, you're going to get some biased data because most of us have been playing and making video games in the past, so we're not, you know, the model consumer, but you can at least get some data on the cheap just by bringing it to events like this.
Yeah, maybe I can put something together about like good survey questions, or maybe I can find someone who specifically does that job to do a presentation for you guys. But, I mean, I've done it in the past too, but there's definitely people who are better at it than me. So I can see if they would like to talk here. But the most important thing is to get your game out in front of somebody and test it, just to make sure that it's like working and doing what you would expect. Or finding out that it's not even close, and then going back and iterating again. We had more questions. So. Let's see. What are the most difficult localization issues you've run into? Yeah, German takes up everything. Also Portuguese. Portuguese is really long. For mobile, I mean, it's very similar to PC, except for you have a very limited amount of space in mobile. Other tricky thing about localization for mobile, and I think localization in general, is that sentence structure is not the same in English. So there's a lot more coding that you're going to have to do around certain languages that might, like, for example, we're saying, I have 3 cats. This is probably a bad example, but I have 3 cats. Some sentence structure might not put the 3 with the cats. Maybe the cat's a variable. So like you could have cats or puppies or ostriches. And the code just has the dogs and the numbers in the same area. But in another language, maybe the number comes in a different, maybe it comes before dogs, right? So you have like dog and then you have number. These are 2 variables the code's looking for. But in another language, it's like number and then dog. That's something tricky that an engineer will have to figure out, or you have to figure out like how to fix those things. Unity and specifically inline sprites seems to be a tricky mess. And that's just not even localization, that's just with text in general. So if you wanna, it's obviously easier to teach a player with symbols. So like spend 5 zoobs and you have an icon for zoobs and you wanna put it in the sentence. Unity has some, with TextMesh Pro, has the capability, but it's very expensive. So on a mobile platform, it's pretty costly. And sometimes it doesn't really work. Yay! The other thing is like in, the other big thing for mobile is that font atlases can get really, really big. So like Chinese, it's gonna bloat out your size of your app.
Colleen, what's a font atlas?
Oh gosh, sorry. So font atlas is all the characters that go into a font. They get, like you, when you have a sprite sheet, which is like all the sprites that go into a game, you also have a font sheet that has all the characters that will go into your font. And sometimes they can get very big. So like you'll have a certain amount of Roman characters that go into the English language. That also will include what's called ASCII, ASCII 2. That's the language that you need for all German, all European, like German, Italian, French, Spanish, English characters. And that has a big list of all what those characters are. And those get put into something called an atlas in Unity that allows you to load all those characters. That's a whole, like, if you want like a technical dive on how to implement all this stuff, that's another thing I'm gonna write down. Because that's like me teaching you how to make UI in Unity, which is super fun and it's super cool, but it will take me like a while to show.
That sounds like a good topic for the Boston Unity group.
Yeah, fonts are fun. I love fonts. Fonts in Unity are really, really cool. But yeah, you have your atlas. So if you want to have it switch to a different language, you need to have another atlas for that language, so that when it loads the other language, it loads that atlas. Otherwise, you'd have it all in this one big atlas, and it'd be huge, and no one would ever load it, and no one could ever see what you're saying. Sometimes you have something called a fallback atlas, which is if someone types in an emoji or types in a Japanese character, and the first atlas doesn't have that character in it, it'll go back, will fall back to the new atlas that will start looking through all your atlases and go, oh, there's that Japanese character, and then it will load it and show it. This is like a really simplified explanation of font atlases. Anyway, yeah, localization. I think the tricky, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that goes into localization, especially for mobile. You have your atlas size can just be gigantic, and then if you're going to go to any Asian country, it's going to get more complex from there. In general, I'm talking about Japan and China. They have a lot of different westernizations in their games, so they're used to having games reading both up and down, or from top to bottom, and from left to right. So it's not that big of an issue. Of course, naturally, they would like to read the way that they were taught to read. So if you can do that for them, it will be their hero. It's a really hard market to get into. Okay, let me go to the next questions. Am I looking forward to designing UX for AR? I have not gotten there yet. I was thinking about doing it. I had this one time where I was in between jobs, or I was thinking about doing AR, and then I was like, only if I get to capture ghosts. But I think it's definitely an interesting problem. So I've been playing a lot of the Harry Potter game, and they have some AR in there, and it can definitely be pretty crazy. There is actually an AR group for UX in the Boston area. They have a meetup and everything. So if you're interested in that, they do AR and VR, and I don't know if they've gone virtual. They probably have, but they do monthly meetups as well. I mean, I can put that in the chat.
They don't go virtual. Who would?
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? Like, they all have virtual backgrounds. How often do you make or recommend changes based on genuine user feedback compared to making an educated guess? I know real users are not always available, especially in the early stages. So really early on, you're going to make a lot of assumptions. You're going to make a lot of guesses. And you're going to write those guesses down. You're going to write down what your assumption is, and then you're going to test. And at first, you might just test it internally with people who haven't, seen it yet, but are still like on your team. And then I would grab users from wherever you can, unless you're under some kind of strange NDA, but like friends, family, bring them to game jams. That's if you have an indie title or something that you can show. There's also some good resources like Playtest Cloud that will get users for you. They do cost money. There's other play groups as well that you can find people to play your game. But for the most part, first you're gonna make educated guesses. Just as long as you keep those in mind that those are educated guesses and that they have not been tested. I would keep a list of those. But real users, you can usually find 2 or 3. For focus groups, you don't need a huge amount of people. You need like 5 people to test a small flow. And then you go into when you get like a larger system and you get further along, then you want to do a bigger test. It also depends on how big you think your user base is going to be. And try to figure out like, okay, start with 5 and then you move to 10 and go from there. Hopefully that answered your question. I'm like really slow through all of the questions. Yes, and Zach Kemsler used to work with me, and he's really smart, and he knows my localization pains. He was mentioning that Korean fonts are also huge. And it really interests me. Anyway, I could go on about language and how the fonts get put together, but I won't. I'm gonna nerd out about it. Thanks, Brad. The AR UX group in Boston is Boston VR. Thanks, Les.
I got it.
That's all the questions. Do people have any other questions? Are there any other topics people would like to hear about UX? And like I could do a whole thing on Unity.
What's one thing that you wish people would stop doing in UX and one thing you wish people would do more of in UX?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. Something I would wish they would stop doing. I really wish they would stop putting animations on all of their buttons on the product. I really wish they would be very selective about what gets a special particle or animation. It drives me bananas when I can't find a thing because everything's just jumping at me, and then I feel like I'm gonna have an anxiety attack. That's a really small request. I'm sure there's thousands of other things that I also drive me bananas. And the other part was
what do you think people should do more of?
should do more. I think people should. I just want to see different iterations on interfaces. Like, I think seeing different ways people can present information or getting people to a flow is always just really exciting, and innovating on that. Sometimes, like, sometimes I get into an app and I can tell what app they copied. And I would really like them to, if they're going to do that, to like take it to a next step and try to actually improve on that interface. Try to find a way to, you know, make it a little bit more exciting and interesting, like add delight. I love that mobile games now are, you know, starting to put the small delightful animations into their interactions and also bringing it into the 3D world. It's really cool. There's a lot more of that going on in the games that I've been looking at. It's so interesting because like I've been playing a lot of Animal Crossing, and all the UI is so much fun. Just the interactions in that game, like you have the whole, you're gonna ride on a plane, and they make everything feel like you're on a plane. Like if we bring that into mobile, I think you could. I think you could bring some of those moments into mobile and make them, you know, these little mini experiences that tell a visual story for the player. What's your favorite mobile device to design for? That's hard. That's not really hard, but if there, I think, I know I've bagged on the iPhone X, but I usually do start from there. I do think it does create a beautiful experience for most applications, and I know that games can adapt to making it look really cool. So I think that's it, though. I hope one day I could also go back to doing some console and trying out the Switch. That would be really cool. I would love to do that. That's kind of, I started with Game Boy Advance, so it'd be fun to go back. But that's not really, I mean, it's kind of mobile, but it's not mobile. It's portable. So there are sites. So there are, for the best ways to test accessibility of color contrast and topography, there are actually sites that you can go to and you can load your photos up that will test for color blindness and will test your font for legibility. The site's names are escaping me. The other thing you can do for totally free, at least for color contrast, is in Photoshop. Sometimes what I do with my designs for color, I will just go and I'll put things on grayscale, and I will see what values look the same. And if all my buttons are all the same value, I know that now a colorblind person in general, if they're on that spectrum, they won't tell the difference between my buttons. So my secondary button, my primary button will look the same. So you can do that with a grayscale to actually tweak your color value so that one will pop more than the other. Pop, we love that word too. That's a great word. What makes iPhone X difficult to work with? Yeah, the stupid notch. There's actually a couple different things that make it hard. iPhone X not only has the notch, which can be on either side of the screen, but also the home menu, if you get too close to the edge of the screen, will just pop up. And sometimes it will cover, if you have your elements all the way to the edge of the screen, it'll cover those elements because the home menu will come up with this little bar. So it's mainly trying to orient your screen in a way that those elements aren't going to overlap anything. And what makes it annoying is that most cases it's hard to then go back for like an iPhone 8. Now you're going to have a gap in your iPhone 8 that wasn't there because of iPhone 10. unless you program or like unless you find a way around of saying, okay, I have to search what device I'm on, which is fine if you're only doing Apple, but if you're doing Android, they have like 5 million devices. So now which device gets a gap and which device doesn't get a gap, and figuring that out. That's why iPhone 10 makes it not hard for the designer to design on it. It makes it hard for you to design for everybody else. I think that's the last question.
Thank you very much, Colleen.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, hope you guys enjoyed it. I enjoyed.
Colleen, that was really great. It's really great. Thank you.
We look forward to a part 2 and a part 3 and however many parts you wanna talk about in terms of UX.
Yeah, this is always really fun. I'll have to put something else together. Thank you guys for letting me talk here. I'm nerding out.
Great, thank you, Colleen.
Yeah.
That was great.
And thanks
this was
everybody
phenomenal.
for coming out virtually.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks for
this
being with us.
This actually seemed to have kind of worked, I guess, because we haven't had any real big technical problems. Bandwidth seemed okay, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, it gives us hope for future meetings doing it remote.
The only thing that makes me sad is I couldn't see anyone's expressions or faces while I'm talking. So I was just like, talk. There are people still there, but it's good to see you all now. So
I can look at encouraging that next time.
I wish there was like an emoji spread. You know, it's just like if you say something a lot of people like, you just see like hearts scroll down the screen.
Yeah, I did
Awesome.
my first virtual class today with, yeah, it was the first one that I was running myself, and everybody was muted. Nobody else had their cameras on, and it's like you're talking to yourself.